As states begin to reopen their economies, the White House is laying out a strategy for ramping up testing across the country. Ben Tracy is following the latest at the White House, and he joins us now. So, Ben, what types of testing are they focusing on, and how does the plan divide responsibilities between the federal government and state and local governments, as well as private companies?
So the tests are intended to be these swab tests, and apparently they've improved these tests where they don't have to stick this swab so far up your nose. They say it's not as uncomfortable as it used to be. And some of these tests will actually be done in these drive-through testing centers that are slowly being set up in the parking lots of retailers across the country. But overall, this plan that the president touted yesterday in the Rose Garden with much fanfare is really mostly repackaging of things the administration has already done, and it shifts most of the burden for testing to the states themselves. It calls the federal government the supplier of last resort and says that the states basically have to set up and manage these programs on their own. The one thing that we have been told here at the White House is that they're going to provide every state in the country enough tests to test 2% of their population. Weirdly enough, that's something the president did not even mention yesterday at the event. It also is far less than what these states actually need to do widespread testing.
Yeah, perhaps that's why the president didn't mention 2%, because that's not what most experts say is required to have, a generally safe reopening of the country. But let's talk about the numbers. I think the president kind of bragged about, I think the number of tests have doubled per month or per day. I can't remember exactly what he was saying. And, he was sort of talking about how impressive that is, that the numbers are going up. But how does that compare to what's happening in other countries?
So when the president talks about this, he's generally right, but he's not telling the whole story. So we have conducted about 5.5 million tests in the country. That's about 1.6% of the American population. The president likes to say we've done more tests than anyone in the world. That's factually true in terms of the number of tests, but when you look at it on a per capita basis, so tests per million people in your country, we actually rank number 9. The number 1 country in the world, incidentally, is Portugal. So that's kind of interesting. So we need to do a lot more testing. I mean, the experts are saying that we need to be testing 5 million people per day by June and 20 million people per day in July. And we have so far only done 5.5 million in total over the course of the last month and a half, 2 months.
Ben, the President of the United States, of course, has been tweeting this morning. And as we approach an astounding number of people who have died in this country from COVID-19, over 50,000, we're very close to the number of people, of Americans that were killed during the war in Vietnam, which is 58,000. The president is tweeting about the press again and about the fact that he's not being asked as much about ventilators. Can you explain to our audience, and of course he's saying that the press is complaining, which of course, I'm not even going to sort of touch upon that. But the fact that the point that the president is making is that he's not getting asked as many questions about ventilators. He is fixated on the ventilator question. Can you just explain to our audience, why the press may have been asking about ventilators a couple of weeks ago because governors were asking about them in the wake of the increasing numbers of people who needed to be on ventilators, and where are we today?
Yeah, it's exactly what you just said. I mean, the ventilator issue was a huge issue a couple of weeks ago because you had governors on TV every day, especially the governor of New York, saying we don't have enough of these and people are going to die. And there was real pressure on the federal government to release the ventilators it had in the federal stockpile, for the president to use his authority under the Defense Production Act to get more ventilators made. And all of that did happen. And the ventilator part of it is somewhat of a success story here. The president likes to call himself now the king of ventilators, and that we're going to give these ventilators to some of our allies around the world who are in need of them. But the reason we don't ask about ventilators anymore is because it's not such a big issue. It's not what states need right now to save people's lives. The president would prefer that we ask those questions so he could talk about what a success that has been, at least in his mind.
So yesterday's briefing was a little bit of a surprise. Initially, we were told that there were not going to be any more briefings, and then we learned that there was going to be one in the Rose Garden. And of course, we heard that there weren't going to be briefings, or not as many, after the president suggested some sort of intravenous use of bleach or peroxide or something along those lines to combat the coronavirus. So we figured, that didn't go over well. Maybe he doesn't want to face the media, but he did. And he was asked directly about whether or not he thought that his words had an impact on the spike in phone calls about bleach and other disinfectants. What was his response, Ben?
He really pretty quickly dismissed that question. When that was asked, I thought it might be one of those questions that would kind of set the president off, but he basically said, I don't know why people would have done that. But we have heard from governors, both Democrats and Republicans, said that they had spikes to their health departments from people who were asking, one, should they ingest disinfectant, or from people who actually did it and then needed help. So this likely wasn't a widespread issue around the country, but even if a couple of people had done that's a real problem. But the president really dismissed that, and he said that he takes no responsibility for that. And his reasoning for what he said over the weekend, he dismissed that all as sarcasm, that he was just being sarcastic, and apparently the rest of us were not in on the joke.
Speaking of responsibility, Ben, let's talk about the new reporting out by the Washington Post that says U.S. intelligence agencies offered warnings about the coronavirus in briefings presented to the President of the United States in January and in February. What can you tell us about those reports and how the White House is responding?
Yeah, so the Washington Post is saying that there were more than 12 warnings that were in the president's PDB, the Presidential Daily Brief, and that these were happening in the very early parts of this breakout of this virus in China, and then once it became an epidemic, so back in January and February. What's notable about this is that if those were in the president's brief, and if he was briefed on that issue, or if he read it, the president was then saying publicly things that were very much downplaying the threat of this. He was saying that cases are under control, that come April this will disappear like a miracle. So if the president got that information and then was saying something very different publicly, there's some questions there. But there also are some questions to the extent of whether he got the information or not. There's been widespread reporting that the president doesn't always read the brief or take the briefing. So it's not entirely clear how many times he was told that, but there certainly was a disconnect between the intelligence and what the president was saying publicly. Now, the White House has pushed back pretty hard on this, saying that the president never downplayed the threat of this, that he was always kept well informed. So certainly a disconnect there.
Yeah. The White House is also saying that the president is so busy that he has no time to eat, Ben, but he certainly has time to tweet, as evidenced by this weekend. As always, Ben, from the White House, we appreciate it.
Thanks.